If you're in the middle of nowhere, there's nobody around for hundreds of miles in all direction. Everything you need to survive is in your boat. And if you lose that boat, you're hooped. At the very best case scenario is you manage to message out to the outside world and you're going to be paying $10,000, $20,000 for an extraction. That's an expensive place to screw up. Assuming you survive, most people don't go into serious bear country. If the risks of getting eaten by a bear do go up as you get closer to, say, Hudson Bay, which has got the densest concentration of polar bears in the world. On other trips up there, I've seen 14 polar bears in 24 hours.
Before we get into the book and the learnings, I'd love, just for our listeners, a little bit of history on how you got here, the experience with Jiu-Jitsu. I'm assuming you're still instructing on some level, and also being a firefighter.
Yeah. I guess the twin pillars or the twin passion pillars of my life have been the martial arts and then the outdoors. I mean, one of my very first memories, I don't know if it's my first memory because memory is unreliable, but it's certainly a very, very early memory of mine is waking up in a tent when my parents were camping on a lake. They owned a piece of property on a lake and they were thinking about building on it. They ended up building somewhere else, but we went there a lot. And waking up in the tent, I can still smell the canvas. I can still feel the log that I was sleeping against. It was under the floor of the tent. And it clearly, at some point, it glommed onto me or I glommed onto it. It's very difficult to predict when you present somebody with a smorgasbord of experience that all of a sudden they're going to go, this is, where I live. And I guess the same thing happened with martial arts. I mean, the martial arts is probably a little bit easier to explain. When I went into grade school, I didn't speak English. I'm Canadian. I was born here, but my parents were immigrants. They spoke German at home. I spoke German, and I went into grade 1 not speaking English. So now I'm this funny kid who eventually had glasses and spoke with a weird accent. Now it's just a Canadian accent, I'm told. And certainly was picked on and bullied quite extensively. So it's easy to see why the route to martial arts, especially the way that it's portrayed in the movies, where it's this mystical skill. I grew up in the era of Bruce Lee and ninjas with basically supernatural powers. It's easy to understand why an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old kid would glom onto wanting to have a superpower. I mean, they also want to be superheroes. They also want to join the Avengers someday. And if you had presented me with the potential to either become an Avenger or to become a full-time ninja, I would certainly have signed up. I would have signed on the line, which is dotted for sure when I was that age. So hopefully my relationship with martial arts has changed a little bit over the years. And it's kind of stood there at the same time as the passion for the outdoors has continued.
Yeah, and I've looked at your website, GrappleArts. So GrappleArts.com. So you're still making instructional videos. Are you still teaching jiu-jitsu?
Yes. How I teach is a little bit different from how most people make their living in martial arts. When I thought about opening a school, I was also thinking about becoming a firefighter. And the firefighting schedule is not a 7-day schedule. It's an 8-day schedule. So I was like, how the hell am I going to reconcile an 8-day schedule with, classes are Monday, Wednesday, and Friday nights, or whatever the schedule would be. So I decided in the end, and I kind of stumbled into it without a clear vision of what the goal would be, to go for an online teaching model. So most but not all of the teaching that I do and the training that I do is one-on-one. I have in my house, I have built a dojo. So that's when you have no time, then you try to accommodate for that. So I have people traveling to train with me, and that's how I do the majority of my training. I do teach classes occasionally, mostly to help friends out. I do teach seminars occasionally, because that's a great way to get out and meet people. So I would say my journey isn't typical, at least at this stage. I mean, there was a stage when I was going to classes like everybody else. Also, the advent of the internet has really changed how people can do many things, right? If you wanted to become, I don't know, a professional video editor, say, I'm just picking that as an example, you could do it in theory without ever going to school, because there are an infinite number of YouTube videos or paid resources out there to coach you through the journey of, in this case, becoming a video editor. Similarly, if you're willing to put in the time and if you're willing to put in the sweat, you can do quite a bit of training on your own, and you can develop. I learned how to paddle a canoe from a book. Yeah, I went and did it at camp and whatnot as a kid, but it was Bill Mason's book, Path of the Paddle. Bill Mason's kind of like the Canadian god of canoeing. That's, I remember sitting above my first set of rapids with a friend of mine, and we've got the book open and we're like trying to identify the different river features and trying to figure out what move we're going to do, and making a lot of those mistakes. So long as you're willing to take theoretical knowledge and then try applying it in the real world and then calibrating what you do, you can learn an awful lot of stuff nowadays. It's kind of an amazing time to live.
Yeah. Well, the thing I like about that, and I heard you talk about this in other podcasts, there has to be live resistance. So you can read about jiu-jitsu, you can watch all the videos you want, and then you get on the mat and you're destroyed because you didn't apply it in the real world. So I'm actually calling right now from my my home music studio, and I've played over 1,000 nights on stages, and I've just a lot of history with music. And I know and I play guitar, so a lot of guitar players would get really good just sitting there and they sound great. You put them with a band and they fall apart. They're not used to it. So live resistance applies everywhere, right? It's learning about business. If it's just out of a book and you get a degree and you think you know everything, you don't unless you've been applying it out in the real world. So maybe talk a little bit more about that, because I think that the wisdom there is incredible and a lot of people miss that. They think they can just understand it intellectually and then be.
For sure. So when we're talking about live resistance, for people who haven't trained, imagine the prototypical Kung Fu training montage or visions of everybody standing in a row, punching in the air, each knee, san chi, and just doing thousands of repetitions, or the guy who's getting ready to avenge his father's death by the big showdown with the bad guy, and he goes off into the mountains to train. And he's jumping around pretending he's a monkey. He's jumping around pretending he's an armadillo, and he's doing armadillo-style kung fu or whatever. That's a fantasy. And it's a fantasy in a number of ways, because you will, no matter how much you train, you will not be able to defend the 30 minions who are guarding the temple of your opponent that you're trying to storm. But more fundamentally, you're not training against what we call live resistance, where, say, you and I are doing Taekwondo. I might have really beautiful kicks, but if I'm not used to trying to kick somebody while they're busy trying to kick me, I can't apply it. Same in jiu-jitsu. If we're rolling around on the ground, I may know all these techniques, but if I don't get to apply it against you, trying to apply a choke, apply an armbar, when you're resisting 100% because you really don't want to get choked or armbarred, and you're trying to do it to me, that's where the magic happens. So similarly, you could read all the business books you want, and it's probably good. Like, that theoretical knowledge is good. But calibrate it by trying to sell stuff on Facebook Marketplace so that you can learn how to write good web copy to actually get somebody to get their credit card out or message you and say, yes, I will buy it at the price that you're asking. So that would be kind of or go work at a stereo sales room and try and actually sell somebody a stereo or a used car lot or whatever. So yeah, there's the theoretical, and the theoretical is important and it can improve your skills, but of course you have to live test it. And in the martial arts context, that's why I like jiu-jitsu so much, because although boxing is beautiful, if you and I are doing live training in boxing, we're inevitably taking concussive damage. It's just the nature of the sport. And to some extent, I'm sorry, but I know you did Taekwondo, but it's true there as well. And I think in the last 10 to 15 years, as we become aware of the massive downsides of taking shots to the head, it's unfortunately, there's a real heavy cost to bear for boxing is beautiful. Boxing's very effective. Boxing's really bad for the one part of your body that you can't replace, which is your brain. So with jiu-jitsu, I mean, most fights involve some kind of grappling, whether that's stand-up grappling or grappling on the ground. And even the act of getting off the ground is a grappling skill. But you can train all that reasonably safely. Yeah, there are definitely injuries that are possible, but most of them aren't of the concussive variety. I mean, ultimately, I've had my arm repaired. I've had that bolted and plated, and that's a bad injury that happened. But an orthopedic surgeon is much better at fixing your body than a brain surgeon is at fixing your brain. They can't undo chronic traumatic encephalopathy, and probably never will. So this training against resistance is important, but how do you do it safely? Just while I'm ranting here, in the context of canoeing, so I regularly go as far north as I can and do difficult trips. And one of the dangers up there, not the only danger, but one of the danger up there is running whitewater. So that would be the wrong place to get good at learning how to run whitewater. If you're in the middle of nowhere, there's nobody around for hundreds of miles in all direction. Everything you need to survive is in your boat. And if you lose that boat, you're hooped. You, at the very best case scenario, is you manage to message out to the outside world, and you're going to be paying $10,000, $20,000 for an extraction, and you're going to be losing $10,000 or $20,000 worth of equipment. That's an expensive place to screw up in a rapid, assuming you survive, assuming you don't break something, assuming you don't drown or get hypothermia afterwards. So the place to practice those skills against live resistance is in a relatively safe environment, say on a local river with a bunch of friends, wearing a dry suit, trying difficult moves in easy whitewater so that you're pushing yourself, but you're also limiting the potential downside, right? You don't lose everything. I'm sure there are examples in investing as well, right? There are bets that you can place where the downside is so incredibly strong that you could, lose everything with one bet. And you're generally trying to avoid those catastrophic failures.
My gosh, I've seen that everywhere. Like one of the things you said in the book is test everything. And so when I think about investing, and I've done a lot of it and I still do it, invest in what you know and have a really good sort of due diligence process that you go through. But I know folks that don't do that. They invest in enthusiasm or some utopian state where the real business should be the idea of how to get there, and they haven't thought through it and lose so much money going through it. But I thought, let's dig into the book a little bit. I thought it was fascinating. So this is a 41-day journey. It's 1,000 miles. It's just incredible. So much danger along the way. You're about 2 hours into it and you capsize your boat. You're prepared. You're ready to go, and then push. This happens.
No.
Not a great first day. So let's get into this bit. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a major comeuppance. Now, keep in mind, I've been doing wilderness expeditions for 30 odd years. I've done a fair number of solo expeditions. I'm a certified whitewater instructor. I've guided on major whitewater rivers, including the Tatshenshini up at the Yukon-Alaska border. I've taught canoeing professionally. I've run grade 4 whitewater in canoes. I've run grade 5 whitewater in kayaks. So there's the hubris of, I'm an expert. I've got this under control. But on day 1 of this journey, which I'd been working towards in some senses for decades, and we can get into what led me to that later if that's of interest. On day 1 of the journey, I started out in a little boat. I had a ton of food. So I had about 200, 250 pounds of food because I'm going to be in the wilderness for 50 days. That's how much. But I wanted a little bit of buffer. And I didn't pack it very well. So the boat was top heavy. And I was going, and it was windy, and it was choppy. And I'm in the north, not the extreme far north. So there's still, I was only 2 or 3 hours from the little tiny town of like 100 people that I had left. And I had a kind of a little sail up at the front of the boat, and I'm making pretty good time. And I'm paddling along, and I put the paddle down to look at the map because it's a complicated island chain. And while my paddle was down and while I'm holding the map, the wind shifted and hit the sail, and I started going over, and I ended up in the water. So like, I did a fair bit of swearing, but I'm now drifting in the water with my kit. Most of it's tied in, but not all of it, beginning to disperse. It's a bit of a yard sail. And how can this happen? And how can this happen now? This wasn't even a very difficult stretch of river. And there's going to be much more remote and much more difficult stretches of river and of lake coming up. So I eventually got that sorted out. I eventually managed to, I couldn't swim my boat to shore. It's too heavy, but I managed to rig the sail so it stuck up out of the water and slowly pulled it to a little headland and managed to unpack the boat and then repack it and dry myself off, sort of. And then I spent, I'll say, many hours in serious contemplation of like what went wrong and how can I prevent this from ever going wrong again. And ultimately, like, there were a bunch of mistakes I made. I was in a rush to get going, so I didn't pack the boat very well. It's something as simple as have the heavy stuff low. I didn't have the heavy stuff low because I just wanted to get going. I'm excited. Time to go. Let's go. Yeah, that was stupid. I wasn't paying attention to the quality of the wind. There's the wind, but then you got to pay attention to which way is it blowing? Is it gusty? Is it changing directions? And this kind of sensitivity to the environment, which is, I think, a little bit what you're talking about with investing, like really invest in what you know. And that's like, pay attention to the small clues. So I wasn't paying attention to the small clues. In part, I was like, I'm fine. No, you're not. And in part, I had had those skills in the past, but skills atrophy. But there's nothing to bring your skills back into focus. Like, okay, I really have to pay attention here. There can be no more mistakes, because the next mistake, if the lake had been colder, if the lake had been larger, if I'd been further from shore, that could potentially be not only the trip ender, but fatal. Most, when you look at the statistics for canoeing and for outdoor activities, yeah, some people get eaten by bears. Not very many. Yeah, some people get hit by lightning. It's not that common. But drowning on lakes, that's really quite common. And hypothermia is by far the most common way to die in the outdoors.
Yeah, so, you made a really good point in the book where most people are worried about bears, but only about 4 a year are killed by a bear. Yeah. But thousands every year drowning, hypothermia, sure. Drowning. That's
now those numbers are a little bit skewed because, honestly, I don't drink, and I clearly wasn't drinking on a very difficult solo trip. But a lot of drownings on lakes are people gooned out of their mind, falling off of a boat, while they're trying to pee over the edge. Right? There are confounding factors there, and people spend far more time on large lakes boating than they do running whitewater. And most people don't go into serious bear country. If the risks of getting eaten by a bear do go up as you get closer to, say, Hudson Bay, which has got the densest concentration of polar bears in the world. On other trips up there, I've seen 14 polar bears in 24 hours. So now it becomes a serious issue. But in general, people's ability to assess risk is really quite poor. It's been pointed out before that we tend to fixate on getting eaten by a tiger, when maybe we should really be worried, especially in an era before modern medicine, about getting bit by a mosquito. Because how many people have died from malaria as opposed to the spectacular death of getting eaten by a tiger or trampled by a rhino or whatever? Our risk assessment models are way off, and we overestimate the spectacular deaths or the spectacular risks, as opposed to the true risks, which are things like getting bit by the wrong mosquito or hypothermia.
Yeah, for sure. See, the thing I like about, because the way you're talking about this, the lesson for me, and I think for a lot of our listeners, is we can be really good at something, super capable, and we get complacent. We don't go through the checklist. I look at a pilot. Why do they go through that pre-flight checklist every single time? Fixed wing or rotor wing, it doesn't matter. And I think it's largely because of that, and it dramatically improves safety. Now, the thing I loved about the book, and it sounds like it's really your whole life and of sort of discovery, is, kind of leading up to why you do this. But what are we learning when we go through things like this 41-day adventure that you just went through? Now, I've had many versions of that. So as we talked about before I started recording, I was able to do a few ultra marathons. Ironmans. I've gone on 3 to 5 day backpacking trips by myself. I just love being out there. And the biggest thing for me is where I think there's a limit. When I wanted to quit with every fiber of my body, I kept going. And that was pretty cool coming out the other side. And I feel like you're taking that to the next level. For the listeners and for me, for sure, like, what is driving you to do stuff like this? What's led to this?
Yeah. Well, it's obviously there are a couple of different reasons. I mean, one thing, especially about the Arctic, is it's an incredibly beautiful place. It's a very difficult operating environment, but it's also an incredibly beautiful place, and it's difficult to get there any other way. I mean, yeah, I suppose you could charter a private jet or a jet ranger helicopter and get dropped off there. And now, yeah, I've been to the Arctic. What's the joy in that? It'd be like getting some new super helicopter to drop you off on the summit of Mount Everest while you're breathing pressurized oxygen and going, yeah, I summited Mount Everest. Well, did you really? I mean, yeah, you stood on top of it, but how proud of yourself should you really be? So a part of it is trying to get to incredibly beautiful places. And for me, incredibly beautiful places are typically places where there aren't a lot of other people. So unfortunately, in the modern world, it's hard to get away and get into solitude. And I think solitude is really a special thing. And I really like going on trips with people, and I like guiding. When I was a professional guide, I enjoyed it, but it's a very different experience. Doing something like going alone, it gives you an incredible amount of autonomy. It allows you to, I mean, ultimately, all the decisions are yours. Everything's your fault, and everything's because of you. So it focuses the mind wonderfully. It allows you to forge a really deep connection with nature. And I don't mean that in a woo sense. I mean that in you have to pay attention all the time. You have to pay attention, as I was reminded of so harshly on the first couple hours of my trip. Pay attention to the wind. It matters that you're feeling the wind. It matters that you're listening to the wind. It matters that you're listening to the waves. It matters that you're looking at the shape of the waves and how that's changing. It matters that there's a little tiny hill over on that shore, and that shoreline over there doesn't have any trees. And it matters that the reeds underwater are bent. And the more clues you pick up, the easier your journey will be, the safer it'll be. And it's so easy to get woo-woo about connection with nature. But ultimately, when the native people were out there, and I would argue they had a very, very strong connection with nature, a lot of it was, how do we get our next meal? Right? It matters how old that caribou track is. It matters that, that this wildebeest that you're hunting seems to be limping. And if you can tell that from the tracks in the mud, which I can't, but I'm sure somebody hunting a wildebeest with a bow and arrow would be able to pick up. It matters that this one is limping. Now maybe we can catch it. So it creates an incredibly deep connection with nature, and it allows time to turn inward. And that's a weird one, because it's not like you're sitting there thinking lofty thoughts and philosophizing very often. Most of your mental processes are occupied with the minutia. Oh, my left shoulder is beginning to hurt. It's been 45 minutes since I've eaten. When's a good place to eat? I should remember to hydrate. I'm getting a little bit too hot. I should open the zipper or whatever. Where am I going to camp tonight? Are those clouds in the sky? Is that smoke from a forest fire, or is that just a sunset? That's most of what your mind is going through. But it's kind of like, by occupying the body, walking or paddling or doing something, and occupying your kind of analytical mind, it allows deeper processing. And the places that you can get to there can be quite surprising and quite meaningful.
Yeah, that's fantastic. One of the big lessons for me out of the book and listening to some of your podcasts is this difference between happiness and satisfaction. There's so many gurus out there that will tell you, if you're not happy all the time, something's wrong. Give us a bunch of money and we'll fix it for you. Crazy. For me, my internal most important number is fulfillment. That's something I can steadily grow over time, but I go in and out of happiness, but depending on what's going on, there's, in fact, you commented on it earlier, but I thought this t-shirt I'm wearing, Struggle Better, is perfect for this conversation with your background. But, talk about that, the difference between happiness and satisfaction and how you came to that conclusion.
Yeah. Well, this difference was driven home to me kind of accidentally after the trip. I was having dinner with a couple of friends, and I was telling stories from the trip, and I was, then this terrible thing happened, and then this day was really tough, and now it was a forest fire, and then there was a bear. And afterwards, one of the people looked at me and kind of confused, like, but did you enjoy it? And I felt confused by their question, because I didn't know why at first, and then I figured it out. And the answer was that it's the wrong question. I did enjoy parts of it, but a lot of parts of it, I was worried. I was cold. I was hungry. I was tired. I was physically exhausted. So if I was been seeking happiness, I should have been on a beach in Fiji, maybe on one of those huts that's out over the water with people bringing me, fresh coconut and pineapple snacks. That'd be nice. That would make me happy in the moment. But what I did feel at the end of it was satisfaction. And it was a very deep satisfaction. And I think satisfaction and fulfillment probably are very close. We may mean the same thing we'd have to sit down and figure out where, if any, there's any daylight between those two things. But I'm going to argue that
I think we
satisfaction. Yeah. So I like the word fulfillment as well. And I think it's much more durable, and it is cumulative in the sense that, you were reading out my bio, and I'm at the beginning of the podcast. So thank you very much for that. It's like, wow, yeah, that actually is a fair amount of stuff. Like I've managed to, mostly by not stopping and being, stubborn like bull, accumulate a fair amount of experiences that I am fairly satisfied with. I'm not done yet. Hopefully I've got a few more achievements left to go. But I think chasing satisfaction and using that as your North Star is a far more useful than mostly chasing happiness. I of course, I enjoy being happy, and I wish everyone listening to this and watching this happiness as well. There's nothing wrong with happiness, but it's a different thing from satisfaction.
Yeah, and I don't think it's possible to be happy all the time, because I believe that we're trying to develop ourselves in terms of our character, capabilities, life conditions, all that. It's going to take some amount of struggle, whether it's, micro struggle or something really intense. Can't be happy going through that. And even your example of sitting on the beach and somebody's bringing me drinks, that wouldn't last very long for me. Probably after a day and a half of that, I wouldn't be happy anymore, because I need to be doing something to create value in the world, not sit there and be served. if that makes sense. But it totally gets the point. You also made a distinction around loneliness, and I find this interesting. A lot of my listeners, I think, will get a lot out of this. You've been more lonely, from what I remember from the book, in a city around a lot of people, never lonely out in the wilderness by yourself. Explain that.
So when I did my first solo trip, it kind of came about accidentally. Well, my first long solo trip was also accidental. I was studying at McGill, and I tried to put together an expedition to James Bay, which is the very, very southern part of Hudson Bay, traveling on a fairly well-known route. But it was still a pretty big adventure for somebody who'd never organized a trip that long before. I remember trying to get a whole bunch of people to do the trip, because that's what you did. You did this with other people. You never go alone. And eventually it all fell apart because one person, like, can we go in June? Can we go in July? Can we go in August? Can I join you guys halfway? I'm only available for this period of time. Can you guys move all of your scheduling around my schedule? And eventually it's like, no, this is going to happen. Basically, I want this to happen. And I think the only way I can make this happen is by doing it alone. Yeah, we were also beginning to, with at the end of university phase where everyone's scrambling for a job. And that phase would come very soon for me. But deciding to go do it alone. And so it was a difficult trip, especially for my skill level at the time and my knowledge level at the time. And I had concerns. There'd be bears, there'd be whitewater, there'd be navigational challenges. But my biggest fear was that I would go out there and feel lonely. Right? Big, tough guy who's already spent a fair bit of time in the wilderness goes out and ends up being lonely. And strangely enough, I've never felt lonely when I've been out by myself in the wilderness. Not once. Now, I can't necessarily psychoanalyze myself to tell you why that is, but it doesn't mean I'm immune to loneliness. As you hinted, I have felt lonely many times in the city. Right. And I think it's because you have this abundance of opportunity around you. It'd be like being a starving man, but being in a supermarket, as opposed to being starving, but there not being any food around. If there's no food around, I think it'd be easier to bear. Starving's perhaps a bit strong. To be hungry and there's no food around, well, I just got to keep on going till I get to food. To be hungry and in a supermarket, to have all this opportunity there, it just illustrates how the context affects the experience. By choosing to go alone, and there are advantages to that and disadvantages, by asserting that you want to do it and that you're choosing to do it, it really changes the dynamic. One of the disadvantages is that you don't have anyone to share the experience with in the moment. And that's sometimes when you're seeing something wonderful, that's a little bit of a sad thing. So my compromise there is to share my experiences through photos, through videos, through books, through podcasts as well. And that makes the experience not just mine, but it spreads it out a little bit. Is it as the same as sitting there with somebody else watching the footprints of a moose in the river bottom where a moose has just passed? And each footprint, because it was just put into the fresh sediment of the river bottom, is smoking. So you see like these flaming underwater hoof prints. That's incredibly cool, but only I'm going to remember that now. And maybe some people who can visualize what it was. So I think by choosing to go alone is very different from being forced to be alone.
Yeah, on my excursions where I'm out, 5 days, maybe the longest, where I'm by myself, hiking, camping, whatever, I've never felt alone. I mean, it's so amazing. And the only time, and it's very rare, but the only times I have felt alone is when I'm around other people, which is so I think we're really shy on healthy communities. I feel like we've gone the opposite direction of that the last couple of decades, in my view.
How do you mean?
Well, people are spending more time on their mobile devices. I think it's something like 60 or 70% they're spending time there. go back 50 years or more, and they spent the majority of their time with their friends and family.
Sure.
And so I think we're getting away from that. And I think that's really leading to it. So, having community and coming back to that, I think, is something we all should be striving for. And one of the things I loved about my martial arts community, I haven't taught for about 10 years now. I still stay in touch with most of them. I can go anywhere in the world and they'll put me up and we can hang out and laugh and have fun. So that's one example of community, and the opportunities are everywhere, thousands of different, ways to do that.
And partially why your Taekwondo community is strong is because Taekwondo is not an easy thing. So you are sort of suffering together. Sebastian Junger has written about this rather extensively. The sense of camaraderie that gets formed when you go through a difficult experience together. Say at the fire hall, it's kind of weird, but when we go to a difficult fire or a difficult emergency together, yeah, there might be disturbing experiences there. But at the same time, it really brings the crew together. And the sense of energy that a crew has after a difficult fire is very different from if it's a slow period and you're not going to anything too meaningful. So the act of suffering together, especially if it's chosen, but even if it's not, I mean, the example there would be the Battle of Britain, when, objectively there were, Nazis were killing quite a few English people by dropping bombs on their houses. From the accounts, it really sounds like the community did come together. And it's like they were, by suffering together, sort of the civic connections were stronger. And there was suffering. I'm not saying we should all get bombed to feel closer together. We do have options to participate in more difficult things, and so despite being known for doing a lot of my travel alone, I also have the opportunity through martial arts training and through firefighting and through the occasional group wilderness trip to engage in that kind of bonding. And it's incredibly connecting.
Yeah. And I think that kind of applies everywhere. I think about different businesses that I've started. A few of the folks I would start them with would say later, had I known how hard it was going to be, I never would have done it. but what I noticed is that when you're with the right community or right group doing something, in this business example, the harder it got, the harder we laughed. And the friendships that are forged when you're accomplishing amazing things. Now, the person that told me in this one example, had I known, I never would have done it. Fast forward 23 years, he got a check for $30 million for his.
Well, that does make it a little bit. That does change the context of it, doesn't it?
But this is about staying in the game and doing the hard stuff, especially when you don't want to do it, because you have to keep moving forward. And you talk about that in the book. There was one part that stood out to me where, I mean, you obviously have incredible resilience and you just keep moving. But you said, I need something. And so you're listening to a podcast or music, and that's going to get you through. We always have, in my opinion, I think we always have more in the tank than we realize it every time. It doesn't matter. So as you push through that, how would you describe that? That's how I think about it. And you use that as a distraction, the podcast, but we always have more. And we have to figure out a way to tap into it. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I do think people have way more, call it endurance, than they give themselves credit for. And in part, it's because we don't really get to push ourselves to the limit very often in modern day society. So by creating things like deciding to run an ultramarathon, that is one good way to create that, let's see how far and how hard I can go, and let's get closer to my actual limits. There's a story about a coach watching a marathoner, though, and the marathoner crossed the line, and it was an excellent time. And the coach turned around and said to his friend, he could have gone faster. And the guy's like, what do you mean? He had the best time ever. And he said, no, he's still alive, right? In theory, if, let's say, the guy had taken a whole bunch of methamphetamine in the last 1 mile of the race, there's a chance that he could have gone an extra, cut another 30 seconds off of his time or a minute. Now, he might also drop dead as soon as he crossed the finish line. So when it comes to physical endeavors in dangerous area, you can balance two things. One, you can go probably harder and longer and further than you think you're capable of. On the other hand, is a question of should you, because if you go to 100% if you're operating at 99% of your limit, and then something goes wrong, I'm going to go at 99% of my limit because I know that if I get there, then I can rest. But then all of a sudden something goes wrong, you went the wrong way, you've got to go further than you think you did. And now you don't have anything left in the tank. That can be really quite dangerous. So I think we have to distinguish between going 100% mentally and 100% physically. And when you're operating that close, it'd be like saying, I'm in an investing example, I'm going to take every single penny I own. I'm going to empty out my piggy bank that I've been keeping since I was 2 years old, because there's an extra $30 in there. I'm going to take every credit card, every line of credit. I'm going to remortgage my house. I'm going to sell my car, sell all my clothes. I'm just going to make this one bet. Like now, if something goes wrong, you're screwed. So you probably can go further than you think you can. And it's good to push that. At the same time, it's a difficult dance because at the same time, you have to leave something in the tank for when something goes wrong. So I think things like an ultra marathon is a great idea or even a 10K, because say you decide to run your first 10K race, and let's say something goes terribly wrong. I don't know. You totally bonk and you collapse at the side of the road. The odds that you die are fairly low. Somebody's going to see your body, they're going to call the ambulance, and you're probably not going to die. So I would recommend that people who want to push their limits do something like a 10K race, not a 10K solo swim from one Hawaiian island to the other. Because if something goes wrong out there, you're just going to disappear in the Pacific Ocean and never be seen again. So that's always the dichotomy. You can go further, and the place to push yourself further, honestly, like one relatively safe place is in the gym. If you want to run treadmill sprints, I mean, you can end up, if it goes very poorly, you can end up throwing up. You could maybe fall off the treadmill. Likelihood of dying, fairly low. Likelihood of a catastrophic injury, fairly low.
I was going to say, I'm super interested in the sort of mental, emotional connection to those limits. Because I've had situations where, man, I can't do much more. I feel like I'm right on the edge, and I'll get a piece of news. All of a sudden, my whole body's dies again. Yeah. So I think there's a lot there. Like, here's the limit. Let's say you can even tap into the limit, but something can happen emotionally that removes that barrier and goes to the next level. Have you experienced that?
For sure. And there's all kinds of tricks that you can play with your mind, right? I'm a big advocate of lying to yourself. And because once you get momentum going, momentum tends to sustain itself. So in a martial arts context, when I'm really tired, what I used to tell myself was, dude, you don't need to train. You just need to bring your gi and go to class. And if you walk through that door and you get changed and you still don't feel like training, it's okay to go home. 90% of the time, maybe even 95% of the time, when I made that deal with myself, I'd end up walking through the doors and then get that sudden burst of energy. So ironically, by giving myself permission to bail out, it increased the total number of times I ended up training. Similarly, on that expedition, that particular one, because that was a really hard one, I would lie to myself all the time. Look, you just need to get out of bed. You just need to put in 10 kilometers. You just need to go for a couple of hours. Let's just see what's around that corner there. And 95% of the time, that 10 kilometers turned into 20, turned into 30, turned into going for the whole day, because even though you didn't feel that you had it in you, once you had some momentum going, you were able to continue. Then other tricks I would use to keep that momentum going would be things like trying to dissociate mind from body. Right? Just let your body do its thing. So I used to have a purist approach to not using any kind of headphones or earbuds or music or podcasts or anything in the bush. Now I think of them as kind of a performance supplement. I think of them as, I could take a tab of caffeine, and I do carry caffeine tablets. I don't use them often, but if I absolutely had to keep going and I'm dead, that would be one trick. I might pop a caffeine tablet. Another thing I might do is pop some earbuds in just to give my mind something else to think about. If it's thinking about the end of the Roman Republic, if it's trying to follow what the Gracchus brothers were doing, then it's less time spent focusing on your own suffering, and your body knows what to do. Another trick is breaking it into smaller chunks, right? I don't need to paddle for the next 5 hours. I just need to take another 100 strokes. So then you're counting strokes, 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 100, and then you start again. So that does two things. It gives your mind something to think about, counting numbers, and it also makes the task seem not as overwhelming. College students do this. Well, I'm assuming college students still write their own essays, which is a big question. I mean, what percentage of college essays are written with AI nowadays? I'm going to say it's very high, but I just need to produce another 500 words. Let's just focus on the next paragraph that I need to write. I'm video editing something for my martial arts channel. I don't need to launch this whole thing tonight. Let me just get to this point. Oh, I'll go a little bit further. Let me go to that point. Oh, I'll go a little bit. Might as well get it all done. By breaking the task up, it makes it seem much more palatable. And by lying to yourself continuously just to get started is also a useful trick. I don't know if that's using the dark side of the force, but it's worked for me.
It sounds like a great hack. And just a quick side note, love the videos on your website for jiu-jitsu training. And the funniest one I saw, because your sense of humor is amazing, it's the 2 worst self-defense techniques. It's like guaranteed to break your forearm to give the other side and stab yourself in the foot by dropping your knife on it, right? Anyway, hilarious. Thank you.
And it just goes to show you what happens, what crazy places you can go to if you're living in theory land, right? It would be totally possible to design, if you only lived in theory, you can come up with some crazy theories that are totally sound. Right? There's a saying in physics that in theory, reality and theory are the same thing. In practice, they're not. Or in reality, they're not. Right? You can create some pretty amazing dream castles, and you actually have to try and knock down your own hypotheses. And I guess that's the basis of science, right? Asking yourself, how could this thing that I've been working on, this theory about, I don't know, how maple trees, the percentage of energy that a maple tree devotes to making maple sap. I'm picking some dumb idea. And you have this elaborate theory worked out, and then how do you disprove that? I have a theory that the way to cure energy levels is by supplementing with coenzyme Q10. Well, how do we test that? How do we test that in a real person? And we would start in a petri dish, then we move to a rat, then we move to humans, and there's a process, and along the way we're trying to murder our darlings. We're trying to disprove the things that we think. Certainly in the bush, I'm trying to disprove the things that I think all the time, because navigation is really, really important, and especially in some kinds of terrain. If you're following a trail or you're paddling down a winding river, it's pretty simple. You should still probably know where you are, but it's harder to get lost. If you're in complex terrain, especially terrain that has either changed or is quite changeable depending on, say, water levels, the map that's in your GPS, the map that you have on paper, may not be representative of what you're actually seeing on the ground. That was so 4 feet of water ago. That island that you're trying to get to doesn't exist at this water level, or has been washed away by the spring freshet long ago. So you're constantly going, I think this is where I am. I think this is the situation. How do I prove it? And then more importantly, how do I disprove it? So it's a continuous process of self-doubt, essentially. Like, it's inculcating self-doubt to prevent you from being very, very certain about something that's completely wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, I love exploring that. For me, when I think about the 3 macro buckets of value creation that I'm, pushing out into the world, because I think it's really good, material, emotional, and spiritual, positive emotional energy to me is the scarcest commodity on the planet because it supercharges everything else that we do. And I get to work with a lot of different communities, underserved communities. I have one community that I've been building since May of last year. We have 29,000 parents in this community raising kids to create value in the world. And it's a place to go for practical family wisdom. And a lot of folks I observe, they can go to some pretty dark places. And it's unfortunate, some of the things that you've gone through, but as a result of that, you've figured out how to get through it and keep going. I think about tragically losing, 2 of your brothers, your mom, the kidney transplant that you went through. You kept going and you got out of those dark places, and so many people struggle with that. What's your advice or what did you learn about being able to do that, to be able to get through things like that?
Well, I want to be clear about something. There's two aspects that I'd like to address. Number one, for me, dealing with tragedy, say the deaths of my brothers, or the death of my mother, or the death of my grandmother, which I watched her basically stop breathing as sitting beside her bed as she was dying, or my own brush with mortality. For me, the place where I go to process that is the outdoors. I'm not saying that has to be the same for everybody. Maybe a Vipassana retreat is where you're going to do it, and maybe some other activity. I'm just going to go to the hiking the Camino de Santiago in Europe is where another person's going to do it. In general, I think you need some time alone. And I think introverts probably need more time alone than extroverts. But there's also a social component to it as well. So what I don't want people to get the wrong idea of is that you can do it all by yourself. I mean, ironically, I did a solo canoe trip, and I've done other solo canoe trips, but that is as part of a community, right? I can't do that entirely by myself. I have kids. I have to consider them. I have a wife. I have to consider her, and she's helping me. She's sending me satellite texts going, hey, the weather's going to get really terrible tomorrow. That's valuable information. I'm relying on, even if I never use it, an infrastructure of rescue. I'm relying on bush pilots who I've never met and may never meet, but in theory, they could come get me if something went terribly wrong. I'm relying on a medical system, and that if I develop some horrific infection that would have killed Thrag the caveman, I'm probably going to be able to, if I can get to treatment or get to my medical kit, I can probably take the right number of antibiotics. So at the same time, I'm out there doing it by myself, but there is a team behind me of people I've met and people I've never met. So it's both. I think for processing difficult things, I think you need time alone. And then it helps to have a community as well, because left unchecked, your mind can go to some very dark places. So if you have got somebody going, hey, dude, it's not actually so bad as you're saying, especially if you like and know and trust that person, that can be very valuable feedback coming in from somebody who's not just a yes man. So it's it's navigating between those two things, time alone to actually process something and time with community and people to kind of provide insight or provide an alternate perspective or just to provide support. And both of those things are important.
Yeah, I think that's really, really good advice. Talking about like our bodies and as sort of a foundation, like health and well-being for everything else that we do, getting through dark times, persevering. I loved when you talked about survive now, win later, and how to go through all that. We don't have a lot of time left, but what's your advice on taking care of our bodies to be able to get through more of these struggles in a healthy, productive way?
Well, do what you can, and doing something is better than doing nothing. So to get ready for that 42 or 41 day solo trip, I had a whole training plan mapped out. I was going to do a whole bunch of upper body weight training. I was going to work on my cardio a little bit. I was going to do especially lots of paddling to get ready for paddling. That makes sense, right? You're going to kind of train within the modality, in the same modalities where you're going to be testing yourself with. And then man makes plans and God laughs. I managed to injure both of my shoulders in the 9 months leading up to that expedition. One shoulder I injured doing jiu-jitsu, and that was my own stupid ego. A friend of mine, a guy that I'm bigger than, more experienced than, objectively better than, caught me in some stupid shoulder lock, and I was like, no, I'm not going to tap out. Like, piss off. And I managed to get out of it, right? Just inching my way out, little adjustments by breathing, and wiggling out, and I got out. Yay me. And guess what? That shoulder was completely buggered for 9 months. The other shoulder I injured racing my kid on a skateboard. Now, maybe I shouldn't have been racing on a skateboard at my age, but whatever, you got to have some fun too. And so I went into this expedition basically unable to have done any part of my training plan. By the end of it, I could do about 10 to 15 push-ups, and I could do some light upper body weight training. But instead, I ended up doing a ton of cardio, just hours and hours and hours and hours using my legs and lungs, legs, heart, and lungs. And how does that translate to paddling? It doesn't really directly, but on the other hand, it gives you that ability to keep going, because mentally you don't start thinking like in terms of minutes, how many more minutes do I have left to do? You start thinking in terms of hours. At least I find that if I'm doing long, slow cardio, zone 2 training, you're often going to go for about an hour, maybe on a long day, you're going to go for 2 or 3 hours. And it makes 1 hour of effort seem like a digestible chunk, as opposed to, I'm going to suffer for the next 30 seconds, I'm going to suffer for another 30 seconds, and let me add it up. No, you're going to go for an hour, and that's the currency of your effort. And I guess it also helps with things like your body removing waste products, and it takes one potential weakness out of the equation. And it's pretty simple. Like, do what you can in terms of strength training, do what you can in terms of heart and lung training, especially if we're talking about getting older, right? There's almost nothing that cardiovascular fitness doesn't help. And especially some kind of weight training where you're actively loading your body through your spine, right? Whether that's deadlifting or squatting or hex bar deadlifting, that kind of top to bottom load is so incredibly good for you because it maintains bone density. It gives you a big hormonal benefit. And ultimately, if you're deadlifting 225 pounds off the floor in your 40s and 50s, then the odds of you being able to get up off the toilet when you're 70 go up significantly. So I think obviously weight training has got some aesthetic value, but I think of it much more as longevity training at this point. And so I really do try to include both. Can it always be perfect? No. Can you do what you can? Yeah. Of course, you got to work around injuries or joint replacements, right? Your physical training is going to look a little bit different after a knee replacement than it will 2 years before that. But maybe you can already start doing things that you couldn't do immediately before your knee replacement. Do what you can, and also do what you're going to enjoy doing. Do what you enjoy doing, because if swimming, let's just say swimming is the perfect exercise and it's the perfect mix of strength and cardiovascular training, but you hate swimming pools and you hate swimming, you're not going to do it. So it's better to do, I don't know, walking in the park, if that's what you really like doing, than it is to do which is a suboptimal thing. I don't think you're going to get as many cardiovascular benefits from walking in the park. But if you enjoy doing that, doing the suboptimal thing regularly is better than doing the optimal thing for the month of January after your New Year's resolution and then never doing it again.
Way better than just sitting on the couch. And the thing I love about what you're saying here is do what you can, because it really matters as we get older. I'm about 10 years older than you are, and I had the knee surgery so I can go on 50-mile hikes, through the mountains. Yep. I'm going to keep doing it. And I see myself doing it well into my 70s and hopefully longer than that. So that's my thinking. But I have so many friends as they get older, they stop doing this, and we decline fast. We have to keep doing something.
Yeah. And that rate of decline, when you, like, in your 20s, you can eat like shit, do no exercise, and unless you really overdo the calories, you can still be fairly healthy. But that's, you can take a 5-year break from working out and still look half decent if we're just talking about aesthetics. That's not true once you're in your 40s, 50s, and 60s. Then it really becomes a question of, you're also going to be busier than you were in your 20s probably, and you're going to have more mileage and more injuries, and scheduling becomes really tricky. But trying to do what you can when you can becomes so important. So, I mean, that's actually one of the ironies of having published a book about the outdoors, is in the lead up to the release, there's very little time to do outdoor stuff. So that's the dirty little secret of writing an outdoor book. And, I hope to, not that I'm not enjoying the promotion, I'm very excited about releasing it, but at the same time, I'm looking forward to getting back to the actual activity, and as opposed to spending my life, working around the activity.
Yeah. Well, you put a lot of thought into the book. I love the way you write. Like I said, I'm going to go through it again. I hope you're going to personally narrate it for the audiobook.
We just finished recording it. It should be coming out in Audible. That was quite the journey. You think, oh man, I wrote this. I can read it. Ha, 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 ha. Yeah, it's amazing how it must be a form of dyslexia, or there must be a name for it, where you read something and then you say it, but your mind just plugs in different words. Maybe it's your mind rewriting what you wrote, or just how something appears on the page. Your mind goes, that should sound different coming out of my mouth. And it's amazing. It's a difficult process, and it's a good thing that there's actually multiple people helping you with it, right? There's the recording guy, there's the audio engineer, the audio producer who's listening as you're recording. You're not just off by yourself recording it. Then it goes to processing or post-processing, where they're doing the editing. And then they come back and say, oh yeah, you left out this incredibly important word in the middle of the sentence. Can you re-record this? So we just finished those re-recordings. It's a humbling experience. Just like the writing is a humbling experience. Like, I think I know how to speak English real good, but you're going through the editing, or somebody else looks at it and goes, this sentence makes no sense. And you look at it and you go, absolutely, it makes no sense. That's why it took 14 revisions, 14 rounds of editing. And so I'm a big believer, because I run a business, in split testing when you can, right? Testing not allowing your biases to interfere with actually getting to the bottom of what's really going on. So at one point, I had to decide whether to rewrite the entire book to merge kind of the narrative aspects of it and then the didactic, the analytical parts of it. I'd originally written it as separate chapters, like, here's what happened in the day, and then like, here's what I learned that day, or here's the greater context of it. And I thought that was a good model. And some of the early feedback I got was, no, we want to see this merged together. And I didn't want to do this at all because it would have involved doing a brain transplant level rewriting. So rather than do it all, it's like, okay, that's one person's opinion. I mean, she's a New York Times best-selling author. I should probably listen to her, but let's test this. And so I rewrote the first 5 chapters, and then I gave it out to 8 different friends, and I gave them both versions, version A and version B. And to use new agey parlance, the feedback from the universe was pretty clear. 7 out of 8 people preferred the version that I did not want to do. But that's a pretty clear signal when you have like an 8-fold difference in a split test. It's time to take the winner. So then I had to do another series of rewrites. And I didn't want to do it. I didn't think it would be better. I was wrong. I found a way to split test that decision, like the book cover as well. Like, you should split test that. Most of your authors are probably familiar with Tim Ferriss and the 4-Hour Workweek. The original title of the 4-Hour Workweek was Drug Dealing for Fun and Profit. So you would have never heard of Tim Ferriss if the title of the book had been Drug Dealing for Fun and Profit. He went and split tested that title, I think using Google AdWords or something, and had a much stronger response for that. So I'm not saying you should use Google to split test all your ideas, but if you can try out, if you don't know which way to go, see if you can sample both of them, see if you can get some feedback from the universe or your customer base or your readership, and let them tell you, because you're not necessarily, you might be too emotionally invested in what you've created and the direction that you're going to make an intelligent decision around what actually the best way forward is.
Yeah, makes total sense. So what's the best way people will consume it to have the impact we want? And there's so many learnings and wisdom that you're conveying in the book. So I think it's perfect. So Stephan, we're running up against time. I'm curious, was there any one thing that really stood out in this conversation for you that we've had here in the last hour or so?
Well, I think the conversation around the difference between happiness and satisfaction, I think that's applicable to everybody, regardless of whether they ever step foot in a canoe, whether they ever start a business, whether they ever want to go jogging through the woods. I think that's such a universally applicable lesson that, to start with, just distinguish those two things. Happiness on the one hand, and then satisfaction or fulfillment on the other. And think about which things make you happy, because that's important, but think about which things are satisfying and fulfilling. And they get conflated. And if we can separate out those things, then I think have a much better view of the big picture and maybe a much better idea of how we should be allocating our time and our effort.
Okay, love that. I think that's so important what you just said there. If our listeners want to contact you or learn more about what you're doing, how can they do that?
Well, I'm bifurcated on the internet. If you are interested in the martial arts aspect of what I do, if you search for my name, Stephan _ Kesting on Instagram. I'm Stephan Kesting on YouTube. I'm on most social media platforms, and the main site there would be GrappleArts. I have a free book that's at GrappleArts.com/book, which is kind of an introduction to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and kind of the view from 30,000 feet, which should help you if you actually begin to train or you're thinking about training. If you're interested in the outdoorsy aspect of it, I'm Essential Wilderness. So Instagram would be @EssentialWilderness, YouTube @EssentialWilderness, website @EssentialWilderness. So it's kind of a choose your own adventure. I'm trying to put out value in both of those fields at the same time.
Well, I think you clearly are. And I did download the Jiu-Jitsu book. So thank you for that. I'm looking forward to getting through. I didn't have a chance to yet. And, Stephan, thank you for being here. This has been fantastic for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lee. And I wish you the best with your podcast and your business endeavors and your hiking.
Absolutely. Music, hiking, all the stuff to keep us fulfilled and stacking. And it is cumulative, like you talked about. We can build on it over time. So again, thank you. And this has been the Show Your Value podcast. If you got some value out of today's episode, please like and subscribe. Until next time, show your value to the world.